Hong Kong. We're joined now by the former Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. And I remember, Jeremy, you supported these protests back in July when you were Foreign Secretary. The violence we can see from those pictures now has properly escalated. When you look at these tactics, do you still believe this is helping their cause?
Well, I'm actually concerned about the tactics of some of the demonstrators. When there is a choice between freedom and democracy or the alternative, I think the UK should always be on the side of freedom and democracy. It's what has defined us through large periods of our history. But some of the protesters seem to have an objective to provoke a military confrontation with China. They seem to want a Tiananmen Square outcome as success, and it wouldn't be success for Hong Kong. It would be a disaster for Hong Kong. So whilst my heart goes out to them when I look at the harsh tactics used by the police, and I'm thinking, as we all are, about those people penned up inside the university in Hong Kong now, I think it is very important there's restraint on all sides.
You really think they're trying to provoke the PLA to come into Hong Kong to create a massacre on the streets of Hong Kong? Is that what you actually believe?
Well, I don't think you can make any generalisation about all of the protesters, because one of the things that's very different about this kind of protest is that there's no centralised leadership, but there are some elements who are saying that only a military confrontation with China will show the world China's true colours. And I just think that if that is the objective, then that is very, very dark days for Hong Kong. And I think all of us who are friends of Hong Kong want to see Hong Kong's freedoms preserved, but want to see a peaceful outcome.
But that makes it very easy for friends of Hong Kong to sit back and say there are pockets, so we do nothing. You know that we signed the joint declaration 1984 with China, and that committed us to protecting the rights and freedoms of these people for 50 years. We're not doing that.
Well, you're absolutely right. And that is our locus, the UK's locus, our unique locus in this dispute that we're seeing now between the students and the governments in Hong Kong. Because ordinarily you'd say this is a part of China, we can make our views known, express our values, but we actually have a direct link into this because that agreement was signed by Margaret Thatcher in 1984, and we expect China to honour its obligations, the one country, two systems.
China isn't, and the violence has escalated because they're trying to call our attention. They're trying to get us to notice what's going on. So we can't just say, don't escalate, that's not helping. We have to respond to what they're asking, don't we?
Well, what we did, and I did this very clearly in the summer when the situation erupted for the first time, was say to China that we expect China to observe its international agreements and that it will be a very serious issue for the United Kingdom if they don't do that. And
China's
we have to
not scared of Britain. You know that. The only thing that makes China look up is when Donald Trump talks about trade wars and tariffs. China is fundamentally not scared of Britain's words.
China is a very powerful country, but Britain is not without influence, and insofar as we have influence, we should be using it, and I'm sure we are using it, to encourage restraint and indeed to try and avoid that collapse of the one country, two systems approach, which we negotiated, which has been, I think, a success for British diplomacy and is very important for the future of Hong Kong.
You don't have to talk like a diplomat anymore. I mean, to encourage restraint is a very delicate way of saying, could you please help? They're not. I mean, we can see that China's not coming to rescue the students. We can see that they're not actually going to allow any more democracy. And I just worry. You talked a year ago about democracy being in recession, and you asked the question, what's our plan? What's our role? Is that any clearer now? Because I don't see what that plan is at all.
Well, I believe we are in a very serious situation globally, because the number of free countries, according to the Freedom House Index, which is often what's used to measure this, is declining now, having seen a big growth after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we are seeing from the United States a much more transactional approach to diplomacy. And we're seeing from European countries a desire to talk about democratic values, but much less desire to do something about it. So if you're saying, what do I think Britain's role should be? I think we should be the country that is binding together those countries around the world that share democratic values, because we do have unparalleled links. We are a medium-sized power. That's not a superpower, but not a small one either.
You said last year, we are the home of parliamentary democracy. We have a profound belief in this country's institutions. I wonder if you can look at what has happened over the past few months and look me in the eye and say, yes, we are still the home of parliamentary democracy. We don't lie to our Queen, we don't prorogue Parliament, we don't play around with the rule of law or question the Supreme Court judges. We are still a country that can tell other people how to run a democracy, because I'm not sure you can.
Well, let me surprise you, Emily, because I think that the way Parliament has coped with Brexit has been a total mess. I don't deny that for a moment, and I think it shows that in this country we're not very good at coping with hung parliaments, which is why I hope this election resolves that. But I'll tell you something that is perhaps surprisingly positive. You know, if you walked out of Parliament on any day in the last 6 months and you walk down past College Green and you look at the protesters, you can see a UKIP flag next to a European Union flag, next to a Brexit Party flag, all the protesters actually getting on perfectly well, because in this country we have a tradition of having our arguments inside Parliament and not on the streets, and that is the tradition that we must try and preserve.
But if you look at where the action is coming from, whether it's Extinction Rebellion tying themselves to railings or whether it's protesters and flags and megaphones, the action is from people who've given up on believing that what happens in Parliament will solve or change anything. This is the action of people who think the streets are more helpful than the democracy that goes on inside.
Well, that is why, as someone who voted to remain in the EU, I think it is absolutely essential that we implement the referendum result, because if we didn't, if we tried to unpick it as Labour and the Liberal Democrats want to do at the moment, you'd have half the country who would say, we don't live in a democracy. And the social damage that would do would be extraordinary. So that's why I think the solution to this Brexit impasse is to deliver Brexit, but make it a sensible Brexit, which in 5-10 years' time, Remainers can see that we are trading with the EU, travelling to the EU, studying with the EU, visiting the EU, and we are the best of friends with our European neighbours. If it's that kind of Brexit, then I think it's something that can unite the country.
You've moved us on to Brexit. I want to take a step back to the words of Hillary Clinton, who was visiting here last week, who was talking about the release of the Russian document, the document into Russian interference or Russian influence, and she said it was inexplicable and shameful that this government hadn't released the report. She said she was dumbfounded. Are you dumbfounded that that report hasn't been released, or do you think she shouldn't be meddling?
Well, she's going to say what she says, and we can all cope with Hillary making comments off stage, as it were. But when you're Foreign Secretary, you see all the intelligence, you see all the private diplomatic considerations, and those form the kernel of your advice to the Prime Minister. And so I haven't seen, obviously, that advice this time.
That's exactly what I'm saying. I'm not asking you about Russian interference. I'm merely asking you why it hasn't been released. They had 10 days before any election began in which to allow us to understand what was in that document, and nobody's been allowed to see it. Is that right? Or are you dumbfounded by that?
No, that's what I'm saying. I don't know what the other reasons may have been, why they may have decided that this is not something that's appropriate
Political
to release
damage,
right
perhaps?
Now. Well, it could be that, but it could be other reasons that we don't know about.
But
and
that's
why
not
I think
what we do here. We don't not release things and not tell people why we're doing that. We don't. That's not how we operate. We say we have an investigation into whether the Russians have interfered into our election, and then we analyse it and we make that public. That's how democracies work.
Indeed, but governments decide on the timing of the release of these reports the whole time, and there are often reasons for that timing which are perfectly legitimate reasons that we just don't know about because they're related to security matters. And obviously a report about Russia, there will be a lot of security. Now, I don't know if that's what it is in this case, but that's why it's difficult for us to comment on it.
Does your gut feeling tell you that Russia has interfered in 16 and 17?
My gut feeling is that Russia is trying to interfere into democratic processes all over Europe, anywhere where they can destabilise Western democracies. That is what they are trying to do. I think they're seeing this as a new way of going on the attack against the West. It's extremely dangerous, and we've got to do a lot more to stop it.
In this election, you think there is interference too from Russia?
I think we would be very naive not to think that the Russians are trying to interfere in any democratic process that's happening, yes.
Tomorrow we're going to see the first of the election set pieces, the debates. You were the last one to go head-to-head with Boris Johnson. I wonder what you learnt from that.
Well, I learnt that those debates are often very different in the studio with a studio audience than how people at home view it. And so it's sometimes difficult to judge how well you've done straight afterwards. I hope that we don't just have sound bites, because actually the thing about this election, and I think this is probably different to the leadership campaign in the Conservative Party, you've got two quite controversial, quite Marmite characters leading both parties, and people's immediate reaction is their personal reaction to the individual. But actually we have two very different paths for the country. Different paths on Brexit. Boris wants to resolve it and move on. We'll have another referendum with Labour and possibly a referendum on Scottish independence as well. But also very different approaches to the economy. And my prediction is that as we get closer to election day, it'll be the substance that wins through. And people will stop thinking about the characters, and they'll start thinking, what do I actually want to happen on Brexit? What do I actually want to happen in terms of these huge taxes that Jeremy Corbyn wants to bring into businesses and into the economy? And I think that will be how people decide in the end.
You've called them both Marmite. Were you Marmite towards Boris Johnson? You're supporting him now. I'm sure that wasn't always the case. Did you hate him or love him?
I've had Marmite moments in my career. I'm sure that there are people in the health service who thought I was a Marmite health secretary, but I was probably slightly less Marmite as foreign secretary when it came to that leadership campaign.
Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you.